For decades, the international business company has been the vehicle of choice in financial service industries worldwide, often used in various corporate and wealth management structures due to its flexibility and, of course, its tax advantages. However, with the recent passage of the new laws aimed to eliminate preferential tax treatment, some believe that the era of the IBC has come to an end. In this presentation, we will take a brief look at how the IBC has evolved through the decades, along with its impact on the local financial service industry here in the Bahamas, starting right now. International business companies were first incorporated in the British Virgin Islands under the territory's International Business Companies Act in 1984. This piece of legislation was later duplicated by other Caribbean financial centers like the Bahamas after witnessing BVI's overwhelming success. The BVI would declare its IBC laws to be the most important piece of legislation in the territory's history since emancipation, contributing to BVI's rank as having the 12th highest GDP per capita in the world. The Bahamas would see a similar effect after the registration of over 40,000 IBCs soon after establishing its own International Business Companies Act in 1989. Now, the idea behind the first IBC model was to utilize efficiency and confidentiality as key advantages compared to standard corporate structures. IBCs could be incorporated within 24 hours with only one person acting as its director and owner, long-term exemption from taxes, no accounting and reporting requirements, and could also be redomiciled anywhere in the world, which was a fairly new concept, unheard of in those days. IBCs were also allowed to conduct business anywhere else in the world except for within its own home jurisdiction, while confidentiality was ensured through the use of bearer shares, which made the IBC ownership flexible and convenient. These attributes made the BVI's IBC so successful that the territory had to expand its company registration offices on at least 2 occasions in order to accommodate the world's demand for IBC structures. Unfortunately, international business companies grabbed the attention of various international bodies who recognized the danger of IBCs being at risk of being exploited in order to facilitate criminal activities, with organizations such as the Financial Action Task Force and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, demanding regulations on financial service products in offshore jurisdictions. In the Bahamas, these measures would lead to the banning of bearer shares during the 1990s, while countries like the United States would later introduce tax information exchange agreements as a means to access financial information on its citizens during certain tax investigations, which obligated IBCs to maintain accounting records with its registered office, while making some offshore banks reluctant to open bank accounts for IBCs owned by U.S. citizens shortly after the TIEAs were introduced, as the banks could now be compelled to disclose information on their clients. Now, despite the introduction of these policies, however, nothing could compare the Bahamas for what it was about to take place, as seen here.
The European Union is set to add the Bahamas, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and St. Kitts and Nevis to its blacklist of tax havens next week. Good evening, everyone. I'm LaDawn Davis. According to reports, the decision taken by EU tax experts is set to be endorsed by EU finance ministers at a regular monthly meeting on Tuesday, when the 28 EU governments are also expected to delist Bahrain, the Marshall Islands, and St. Lucia. As a result of both moves, the blacklist would maintain 9 jurisdictions deemed to facilitate tax avoidance. The other 6 are American Samoa, Guam, Namibia, Palau, Samoa, and Trinidad and Tobago. In response to that blacklisting, Deputy Prime Minister the Honorable Peter Turnquest says the Bahamas is disappointed to learn that the EU will be making a recommendation to include the Bahamas on the list of non-cooperative jurisdictions for tax purposes. Throughout this process, the Bahamas has consistently been engaged with the OECD and the COCG on the listing criteria, including as late as last week. Therefore, Turnquest says this latest move is surprising.
So the question remains, has the once attractive IBC suddenly lost its relevance in the Bahamian financial service industry? Now, it's obvious that the EU's blacklist of non-cooperative jurisdictions for tax purposes soon became the IBC's worst nightmare. To remove the Bahamas from the EU blacklist, the country would sign on to the Inclusive Framework for the Implementation of the Base Erosion Profit Shifting Initiative with the OECD in order to show the country's commitment to comply with measures to avoid the exploitation of gaps in tax rules to artificially shift profits to jurisdictions where there's little or no economic activity. The consequence of the new framework, however, would completely change the financial service landscape in the Bahamas almost overnight by making all financial institutions and designated non-financial businesses and professions legally obligated to meet international compliance and anti-money laundering standards. Financial service institutions were now obligated to identify and verify all clients while maintaining a confidential database of beneficial owners of companies which could only be accessed by a designated person, which often included certain local regulatory agencies. Limited duration companies and shelf banks would now be prohibited under the new regime, while new laws would create the role of the compliance officer in financial services along with its legal obligations. Bahamian companies that were ultimate parent entities of a multinational entities group were now required to file a yearly country-by-country report, and companies carrying out relevant activities in the Bahamas listed under the Commercial Enterprises Substance Requirement Act were now required to demonstrate that its core income-generating activities are conducted in the Bahamas and are managed and controlled in the jurisdiction. But the most significant change brought by the new governing framework would be the removal of major tax advantages offered by Bahamian IBCs by abolishing ring fencing features provided by the International Business Companies Act. This allowed companies incorporated by non-residents to enjoy certain exemptions if they were operated completely outside of the Bahamas. Existing IBCs will lose benefits such as the current 20-year stamp duty exemption and annual $300 licensing fee from the year 2021. All IBCs will now require a business license, but only those IBCs with substance and carrying on real business via a physical presence in the Bahamas will be required to pay fees, which will be determined by a value-based calculation using revenue that is subject to value-added tax instead of the current annual gross turnover definition. Under this calculation, passive IBCs found in private wealth management structures will be excluded from paying fees. It is clear then that the IBCs have lost its luster that it used to have in the 1990s, as reform laws have done away with tax-free status, which has been enjoyed by IBCs for well over 30 years, not to mention the imposition of compliance formalities and substance requirements that are likely to increase the overall cost of most IBCs dramatically. The argument at this point is that the new reform laws are likely to deter potential investors from incorporating new IBCs, while current owners are likely to liquidate or simply discontinue paying its annual fee, leading to the business to be struck off the company register. It appears then that incorporating an IBC to carry out business activities for tax exemption reasons will no longer be the right approach under the present framework. Under these circumstances, then, we can consider the IBC to be no more than a blast from the past that has met its end. But I don't believe that it means that the IBC should be written off completely. In fact, legislative efforts over the past decade have made IBCs instrumental in establishing well-known financial service products such as investment funds, captive insurance companies, and the Bahamian banking institution. So it is likely that forming an IBC would be recommended for these activities in the future. And despite the tax reforms, IBCs remain a more flexible corporate structure compared to standard limited companies by retaining a number of well-established advantages as seen in its rapid formation process, minimal directorship rules, and confidential shareholdings. A notable feature of the new regime concerns the ability of international banking, insurance, and securities market sectors to offer services to residents in the Bahamas and to do so in local currency, while local commercial banks will be able to provide similar services to international clients, so long as regulatory approvals are in place. Although IBCs are now subject to local taxes, investors may find it favorable to establish its business headquarters here in the Bahamas to take advantage of a less stringent regulatory environment and, in some cases, a more simplified and cost-effective tax structure that may benefit its business structure. In light of the circumstances, we will conclude that IBCs have simply evolved from a fly-by-night operation into a more substantial entity operating at international standards, attracting investors that are interested in integrating with the Bahamian economy. It is clear that IBCs simply aren't going anywhere anytime soon. Should you have any further questions on this topic, please feel free to visit our website at www.lawyerlex.com.